All right, good morning, everyone. We're missing a lot of folks, but I've got 8:01 here on my watch. So let's go ahead and keep it rolling. This is the third to last lecture of the semester. And we've got a few things to cover. We should be in good shape to get through what I want to cover before the semester winds down. There's always more to talk about. There's always topics. If you're looking through your textbook, you can see there's some whole sections that we just did not get to this semester. And traditionally, I haven't gotten to some of those sections in the past. It's a balance always teaching this class between how much to cover and how in depth to cover it to make sure you have a good understanding. So I'm always trying to strike that balance. If you have thoughts or feedback on that for me, I would love to hear about it. You have your course evaluations coming soon. It's a great place to share that. So just know that we've covered a lot, but there's always more complexities to the human body that we can't cover. And so hopefully we've covered the things that are of interest and use to you. But with that in mind, let me not digress. Let's just keep talking about it. So today's agenda looks like this. We're going to start off with the review activity. It's Friday, so you get to make your own Venn diagram today, which I know you're super excited about. We're going to continue with the endocrine system, probably wrap it up today. And then we're going to play a fun game called Name That Endocrine Organ. You probably have seen this similar show on CBS affiliates. Then if we have time, we'll start in with the respiratory system. If we don't, we'll just start that on Monday. And then we have reminders for you at the end. And I do have another actual Venn diagram for you too. So it's like it's double Venn diagram today. So we've been talking about the endocrine system the last couple of days in class. Remember our major endocrine organs here. Those in red are essentially only endocrine organs. Those that are labeled in blue, remember, serve a dual function. So they're endocrine organs, but they also serve other roles. So for example, the hypothalamus is essentially think of as part of the brain and also an endocrine organ. The thymus, of course, plays an endocrine role and is important for your immune system, etc. So the takeaway message from here is I want you to know the names and locations and general roles of all these structures, and also know that the endocrine system is highly integrated with other systems in the body in its role of regulating the functions of those systems. So to get us started, thinking about the pituitary gland explicitly, notice here that the pituitary gland, or actually, let me go here. Thinking about the pituitary gland explicitly, I want you to work with a partner or in groups of 3 and take 3 minutes to create a Venn diagram describing the unique qualities and the qualities shared between the anterior and posterior pituitary. So you're going to create a Venn diagram that's going to look like this: anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. There's obviously some similarities, obviously some differences, and you can work in a small group. And actually, I have a timer for 4 minutes here. So we'll do that to get started, and we'll debrief that. Oops, excuse me. And see what you've got there. Oops, why is this not working? Still not working. Oh, well, my timer's not working. That's okay. Just go ahead and take a few minutes and do that. And you can, often we do these activities and you start off doing it by yourself and then you work in a group. You wanted to start out with a group, that's just fine. And you can even draw one diagram per group. That's okay. One second. 3, Gia, you want to help me with these guys? Yes. Okay. It's really small in the middle of Here, we're working on a Venn diagram describing qualities that are unique to an anterior and posterior quality. If you want to jump on, grab some really All right, let's see what you got. When you're ready, send a representative from your group down and put two things on this chart where they belong. And we can be brief. So send one person down from each group and just put two items in either of those three categories there.
Maybe like the opposite thing, like one and one. Yeah, that works great. Yeah.
Oh yeah, you have to make sure you don't do the same one. That's okay, Drew. You finish and then you can just do it. Come up with another thing. So here's the trick that my 10th grade math teacher taught me when writing on chalkboard that doesn't speak. Don't hold it like you hold a pencil. Hold it like you're writing with your finger and hold the chalk there and it doesn't speak. I don't understand why. But if you hold it parallel with your finger and then continue writing with your finger, it works a lot better. You can think about, how about think about physical location? What do they share about the physical location? I don't see your fingers.
No, I'll see what you, no, I'll see what you. Well, I don't have anything.
She doesn't write it, I'll write it. If she doesn't, I won't.
I only have one that I write on.
Right here. Is it weird if I say projection onto the hypothalamus, or how do I?
Yeah, that's fine, that's fine.
Good. All right, anybody else want to add anything? Let's walk through and see what you got. So what they have in common, they both, actually, let me start with this. They're both parts of the endocrine system for sure. That's why we're talking about them right now. And they both project off of the hypothalamus and rest. Remember, they're connected to the hypothalamus via a structure called what? Yeah, via the infundibulum. And they both then sit in a part of a bone, and they're protected by this structure in a bone. What's the name of the bone? Sphenoid. And what's the name of that little cup? I feel like this is the thing that we've covered more than anything in this class, is that the pituitary sits in the solitary. It's not particularly important. It just keeps coming up. Anyway, so yeah, they're both parts of the endocrine system, connected to the hypothalamus via the infundibulum, sit in the sola turcica, the sphenoid bone, and both secrete hormones. However, a very, very important difference is that the posterior pituitary does not make hormones. Those hormones are delivered to the posterior pituitary via the axons of neurons that originate, that have their cell body in what tissue? Where do those hormones that are stored in the posterior pituitary, where do they come from? It begins with hypo and ends with thalamus. Good job, excellent. So those hormones, remember, are made in the hypothalamus. So in that way, you can say it's controlled directly by the nervous system. In fact, those neurons have their axon terminals in the posterior pituitary. So it's essentially not only controlled by the nervous system, it's essentially part of the nervous system. The anterior pituitary makes its own hormones, right? And that's a whole bunch of them. We listed like 7 of them in class, including ACTH and FSH, et cetera. And these hormones are regulated by the hypothalamus that creates hormones that travel through the bloodstream to the anterior pituitary, and then signals the anterior pituitary to make and then secrete those hormones. So it communicates with the hypothalamus hormonally, as opposed to posterior pituitary, which communicates with the hypothalamus via neurons. That's good. That's the gist of it. Those are the big takeaway messages. So just a little bit of refresher from what we covered earlier this week. I want to make sure you've got those big ideas. I was also super pumped that my little trick to put the screen up and have the diagram there kind of worked. So put that in the course evaluation. Professor is really good at projecting onto chalkboard. And just leave it like that. All right, what other questions, comments, thoughts you have? Sarah, go ahead.
Should we be able to do something like this for our quiz?
That's a good question. I haven't written the quiz yet, in all honesty, but this would make for a great question. Or, in some way, definitely expect to be tested on your knowledge of the anterior and posterior pituitary, their similarities and differences. If not drawing a Venn diagram, know this stuff for sure. Yeah, so this is a nice study guide for you. If you want to snap a picture of what we've got here, provides a nice little overview of that. Those of you, actually, would someone do me a favor and snap me a photo of this and just email it to me? Because those of you viewing at home, they can't see this. So actually, you know what? Maybe we can. Here, let's get creative. Never mind about the We're going to do this. I'm going to go here and make sure I can get it in the frame for a screenshot. There we go. And actually, you know what? Even better. Hold on. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I'm going to just do this, and then they can get that image. There we go. Yeah. Don't put this in the question evaluation. Okay. Go back to sharing my screen. Those of you watching the video are probably like, what is this guide? Here. Go back there. Sorry, I'm just setting up the Zoom to share the right thing again. Okay, we're back. Other questions, comments, thoughts? Cool. All right, well, let's dive into some new material on the endocrine system then again. I want to make sure, well, we've been walking through the various endocrine organs. Our next 2 endocrine organs, or 3 actually, are derived from the pharyngeal pouch that during early development. I'm not going to ask you questions about that. I'm just kind of putting some of these in a little bit of context for you. And specifically, I want to talk about the thyroid and the parathyroid glands first. Here is an image from your book that shows you on a cadaver the location of the thyroid. It's this kind of butterfly-shaped organ right here. You can't see it very well. The color is not differentiated very well, but you can see that it has a lobe over here, left lobe, the isthmus of the thyroid gland that goes across the middle, and then the right lateral lobe here. And it's kind of nestles right around the trachea, right in the anterior aspect of your throat there. If we look at a diagram where you can see it a little more clearly, actually, let me clarify. This is an anterior view, so this is looking at someone as if you're looking at them like this. You can see how it wraps around the trachea that way. If we look at the posterior view, you can see those two lobes kind of wrap around. They don't come all the way around. And what's important to know here is embedded in the thyroid gland on the left and right lateral lobes, we have these little kind of almost spherical shaped glands embedded in the thyroid called the parathyroid glands. And so these are a different tissue type and they serve a different role, even though physically they're closely associated with the thyroid. And you can see this as a posterior view. The orange that you see here is what's part of the esophagus and the posterior aspect of the pharynx. We'll talk about this in the respiratory system next week, but you can see how the thyroid kind of wraps around the trachea and the esophagus there. These glands are important for regulating metabolism. Now, remember I talked about how Missy Elliott had a thyroid disorder that creates it basically creates a problem for your energy balance where you can, you're not delivering enough energy to your cells, you're delivering too much, so it can result in things like fatigue or hyperactivity. It can result in rapid weight loss or gain. The thyroid also plays some role in calcium regulation, but really it's the parathyroid that regulates calcium. So calcium is a super important ion that's involved in a zillion different physiological processes. So we need to make sure we have enough calcium and it's in the right place, very broadly speaking, and the parathyroid helps to regulate that. So for each of these endocrine glands, I'm putting up this big banner that's like, this is what I want you to know these are involved with. So if I say thyroid, you say metabolism. That's like a good chance. If I say thyroid, you say metabolism. If I say parathyroid, you say calcium. We need Marge here. She's on cheer. She could get us going with this. Marge, if you're watching from home, I have high expectations for you to work in this content to the next game. So that's the big takeaway. We're not going to get into a ton of details or exactly the physiological processes there, just covering it at this level. Let me pause there and see what questions you have. Get you. Mm-hmm. Not really. They're kind of embedded in the posterior here. There's 4 of them. Mm-hmm. Good question. Others? Okay, let's talk about the thymus. Now, the thymus is not new news to you. We've covered this when we talked about the immune system, but I just want to revisit that a little bit. The thymus is inferior to the thyroid. So if you remove some of the other tissues, you can see your larynx and your trachea here. The thyroid is kind of up here, kind of nestled right under your throat. The thymus is actually in the mediastinum, that central cavity in your chest between your lungs, and where that includes your heart and your trachea right in here. So your thymus is more down here, kind of protected by your sternum. The thymus, as you know, is an important immune organ as well. It's the site where lymphocytes mature into T lymphocytes. We talked about that when we talked about the immune system. And this process is regulated by 2 hormones, thymopoietin and thymosin. So those are 2 hormones that help regulate the maturation of those lymphocytes and those specifically those T lymphocytes and how they mature. Again, I'm not going to get into the mechanisms of this in detail. I just want you to know thymus, mature lymphocytes, and it's regulated by hormones secreted by the thymus. So we can think of the thymus as regulating immune cells. Remember, we talked about the thymus getting smaller and less functional with age as well. So part of that is results in the reduction of the production of these two hormones, and then in turn, reduction in the amount of T lymphocytes that are produced. So that's 3 endocrine glands we've covered: thyroid, parathyroid, thymus. Questions? You can eat thymus too of animals. I accidentally ordered one in a French restaurant once. I went to, it was actually this really pretty fancy restaurant, and I was ordering an appetizer off the menu, and there was something about, that's right. So the French word for rice is riz, R-I-S. And there was something on the menu like blah, 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 du riz. But it was R-I-Z. And I just didn't register that R-I-Z was different from R-I-S. So I was like, oh, a rice appetizer, that sounds good. I'll get that. So I ordered it, and it came out in this little bowl. And it's this weird, like kind of spongy texture. It's almost like a mushroom texture. It had this really unique, like musky flavor. And I was like, this isn't rice. Let's eat it. And then I ate it, and it was good. It was sheep thymus. And so the word for thymus in French is riz, R-I-Z. And I just mixed up that and rice. So I had a sheep thymus as an appetizer. It was really good. I highly recommend it. Probably don't make it at home. But makes me think, now that I'm thinking about in this context, it must have been a pretty young sheep. It must have been like lamb thymus, really, because once they get mature, you just have this massive fatty tissue there. Cool. Yeah. Yeah, you can. And it can often happen in the case of kind of overproduction of the thyroid. You can get part of it removed or all of it. And then you can take exogenous hormones. You can ingest hormones that kind of help regulate your energy balance. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my mom had thyroid cancer.
Oh, yeah.
But she didn't have any problem in the thyroid. Like I have hypothyroidism.
Oh, you,
she
okay.
didn't.
Okay.
And she had the cancer, and now she takes the medicine, but it wasn't because of like I don't know how to say it, but the overproduce.
Like
Yeah.
hyperthyroidism. Mhm.
It's just because I don't know why.
Yeah.
It was there.
Interesting. Well, I'm glad she's okay. I'm glad you're okay. Yeah. Yeah. And it can be like, it's interesting because the way it regulates energy, you can kind of get, you kind of get these swings in the symptoms. So it's not like one consistent symptom necessarily. There's lots of different ways that can manifest. Mhm. The thyroid? Not really. No, it's pretty consistent. As far as I know, I don't think it can grow in size. Oh, yeah, you're thinking of a goiter. Yeah, so a goiter, so yes, and I cover this in my A&P class. Who was in A&P with me? Sarah was in there. Yeah, so basically what happens is to produce yeah, you're exactly right, yeah. So to produce the hormones that the thyroid produces depend on iodine. And if you don't get enough iodine in your diet, what happens is through this feedback pathway, essentially your body keeps telling your thyroid to produce more of these hormones. And so it keeps getting bigger and bigger because it's trying to produce more of a hormone, but it can't because it doesn't have the iodine. And so it can become like this huge swollen gland if you don't have enough iodine in your diet. And basically, it's your thyroid trying to overcompensate because it's not producing enough hormones. So yeah, that's exactly right. Mm-hmm. And that's why, like when you buy table salt, so the way that they figured to solve this was to put a little bit of iodine in table salt. So anytime you buy like table salt in the store, it'll say it contains iodine, blah, blah, blah. And just that tiny little bit that you get when you sprinkle a little bit of salt on your food keeps you going. So, and it's in seafood, and other, I think it's also found in some leafy greens like kale and broccoli and stuff like that. But in some places those foods aren't available, and so you get exactly that. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. Actually, that's good. Cool. All right, let's talk about a few more. I want to talk about the adrenal glands, the pancreas, and the gonads. So let's talk about the adrenal glands first. The adrenal gland, it sits on top of your left and right kidneys, so you can see where they are in the body here, and then you can see it in more detail here. Your kidney, and sitting on top of this, you have an adrenal gland. Importantly, the adrenal gland is structured into a cortex on the outside, just like your cerebral cortex is on the outside of your brain. Remember, cortex comes from the word for bark, like on a tree. So it's on the outside. And then a medulla in the center. And these are essentially, we kind of lump this together and call it the adrenal gland, but really it's two separate tissue types and two glands kind of built into one. You can see the structure here. You don't have to worry about that for our purposes. So they're pyramidal shaped glands located on top of the kidneys, and they are highly vascularized. So there's lots of blood coming through there. And they're also innervated directly from the vein or from the brain via these sympathetic fibers. So they interact with your sympathetic nervous system, which remember is the nervous system associated with like the stress response. And this is this is what they do. The adrenal cortex, so that outer part, so let me go back and show you the outer part that you see here, right? That produces hormones, a variety of steroid hormones. So this includes things like glucocorticoids and mineralocorticoids. So glucocorticoids are very often kind of talked about, specifically the hormone cortisol in humans. You often hear this referred to as like the stress response hormone. It does play a very important role in the stress response, more so in stress recovery and like long-term maintenance of response to stress rather than like that acute fight or flight response. And in fact, in the video that I included in our class program, the crash course AMP video on the endocrine system, I put a little disclaimer there that I disagreed with our good friend Hank Green's description of the cortisol as being involved in fight or flight. It's not really that hormone, rather it's more like long-term energy balance maintenance in response to stress and other factors as well. The adrenal cortex also produces this hormone DHEA, which is the precursor to both estrogen and testosterone. There's a whole pathway in there that we're not going to get into. Just know that it produces these hormones that are important for regulating blood sugar. So when I said energy balance, I'm specifically meaning sugar and specifically meaning glucose. And mineralocorticoids help regulate your blood sodium. So again, an important ion that you need to have enough of, but not too much throughout the body. And then DHEA, which is the precursor to these sex hormones that we'll talk about in just a second. The adrenal medulla, the inner part, is essentially part of the sympathetic nervous system more than an endocrine gland in itself. And it's innervated via the sympathetic nervous system. And there's these clusters of neurons that release catecholamines, specifically epinephrine or norepinephrine. So this is commonly what we call adrenaline. So if you're ever in that situation where something happens and immediately you feel like literally like the tingling in your hands and you feel like hyper alert, you're like ready to go. That is the effect of adrenaline. And it's a super quick, less than a second kind of response. This can happen if something happens and you're physically threatened. You're driving your car and someone pulls out in front of you and you have to slam on the brakes. And then kind of afterwards, you feel a little bit jittery. It can also happen in situations where maybe you have to get up and speak in front of a class or something like that. You really don't want to do it, or someone puts you on the spot. Or you can have this response sometimes like you're interacting with your friends and someone really pisses you off, right? This is the traditional so-called fight or flight response. Basically, your body is getting engaged to either fight, to defend yourself if you have to, or run away if you have a danger that you need to flee from, right? And this can happen in sports as well, definitely, when you get, you're super pumped up and, something fires you up. And that is largely the result of the release of these two catecholamines from the adrenal medulla of your adrenal gland. The ratio of epinephrine and norepinephrine can affect how rapidly that response happens and how long it lasts. Again, we won't get into that detail. Norepinephrine actually acts as both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, so it plays a pretty complex role in the body. Questions? Okay, I want to show you this diagram a little bit, some of these pathways, and I'm just going to highlight the parts of this that I really want you to take away from this. First of all, we have the hypothalamus up top here and the pituitary gland here. One pathway to the adrenal medulla involves this sympathetic innervation of the adrenal medulla. So you can see kind of directly down from the hypothalamus through your spinal cord and then to the adrenal medulla. And here we have these catecholamines, or adrenaline, as they're commonly called, epinephrine and norepinephrine produce. And you can see some of the examples of what those hormones do. So they dilate your blood vessels, they release a lot of sugar into your bloodstream, so you have energy to do stuff. Your heart rate increases, your breathing rate increases, et cetera, et cetera. Basically does everything it can to get the body ready to like do stuff. The other pathway here is from the hypothalamus through the anterior pituitary. So there's a hormone released from the hypothalamus called CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, that travels through the bloodstream down the infundibulum to the anterior pituitary, which then signals the release of another hormone called ACTH that we talked about before. That travels through the bloodstream to the cortex of the adrenal gland, where mineralocorticoids regulating sodium and water balance, and glucocorticoids regulating energy balance, and specifically glucose, are produced. So you have this really complex pathway. You have a hormone produced in the hypothalamus that signals to tissue in the anterior pituitary to produce another hormone. Then that hormone signals to the adrenal cortex to produce these other hormones. So again, without getting into the weeds, the important takeaway here is that these are really complex systems that allow feedback and allow them to be regulated in a whole bunch of different places. And so these systems can get really complicated really quickly in the way they operate. We have a good idea of this general pathway and of course these end results. And of course, over the long term, this overproduction of cortisol can have pretty negative consequences for you. It can suppress your immune system, you get sick. This is part of the reason anyway, often, I don't know if any of you have experienced this, after you finish like a really tough semester, you go home and you get sick. A lot of you are shaking your heads, yeah. I mean, part of that is because often if you're traveling or something in there, you might be exposed to other pathogens. But what happens is your body is kind of ramped up that last week or two of classes. You're just getting finals done. You're writing these papers. You're just in the zone like, all right, I'm going to crank through this. I'm going to push through. You're riding on these stress hormones. One of the effects of these stress hormones is that they're moving your energy balance so that you have this energy to do this stuff and suppressing your immune system. And so during that time, you're just cranking through, and then you finally get done and you're like, all right, now I can relax or do some other fun stuff. But that suppression of your immune system catches up with you and you get a cold or something like that. And then it kind of sucks and you're grumpy. That's I don't want to project on you, but that's what happens when I get that. So the takeaway message here is that the adrenal glands situated on top of the kidney are important for energy balance generally and your stress response. I should have added actually in there the mineralocorticoids for calcium sodium regulation as well. So that's the big takeaway there. And we could spend a whole semester talking about the adrenal glands specifically. Actually, it'd be a really fun class to teach because it plays so many important roles in the body. Questions? All right, I've got a couple more for you. I want to talk about the pancreas, which is interesting. The pancreas plays a role, both an endocrine role and an exocrine role. You mean to go back?
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I just have a question.
Yeah.
When you have like a kidney transplant,
Yes.
then is this like recommended to you or?
You know, somebody asked me that recently, and I don't know. Let me get back to you on it. I'm actually really curious how a kidney transplant affects your adrenal glands. Like if they take off the adrenal with it, or if they save your adrenal and stick it on top of the kidney. Yeah, stick it on top of the kidney. I don't know. That's an excellent question, though. All right, pancreas. The pancreas, reminder that endocrine glands are ductless, meaning that their hormones they produce are brought into circulation directly via the bloodstream. They don't travel through a little tube and get dumped somewhere. The pancreas is interesting because it plays an endocrine role. It produces hormones we'll talk about in a second, but also produces digestive enzymes that travel through this duct here. That's your gallbladder. Well, they're produced in the pancreas, and some of them are stored in the gallbladder, and some of them are brought directly into the small intestine through these ducts of the pancreas. And so the pancreas produces digestive enzymes that are released via this exocrine mechanism through a duct and into the small intestine. So you see part of the small intestine here, and it helps you to digest certain kinds of proteins. Or wait, is it fats or proteins in this one? It helps you digest fats, sorry, more than proteins. I got that mixed up for a second. In addition to this exocrine function, the pancreas plays an endocrine function. And I want to walk you through what it does. The takeaway message here is it helps regulate blood glucose. And so it contains these alpha cells that produce something called glucagon. Glucagon basically signals your body to release glucose stores into your bloodstream. And it also produces these, it contains these beta cells, which produce insulin, which does the opposite, which tells your body tissues to pull insulin out of your bloodstream. Now, all of you have heard, of course, of diabetes. There's type 1 and type 2 diabetes. Type 1 is genetic and congenital, meaning that you're kind of born with this condition because of these beta cells there's a mutation in the gene in the beta cells that reduces or kind of makes the production of insulin reduced, or I'll just say that. Then we have, in our modern world, we have something called type 2 diabetes, which is where you're born, everything was fine, but through a number of factors, especially eating too much sugar and lack of exercise, this whole system gets out of whack and your body can no longer produce enough insulin to regulate your blood glucose. And this has a lot of really, really bad consequences, including destruction of blood vessels, and that can manifest as destruction of the small blood vessels in your eye that can result in blindness. It can result in, if anyone's ever had, so too much glucose in your bloodstream can result in essentially toxicity, right? Essentially, you're poisoning yourself through too much glucose. Too little glucose, you don't have the energy you need to do stuff. And if everyone's ever felt like hypoglycemic, you kind of get shaky. Your brain, as I mentioned, really needs glucose all the time. So you start to get a little fog-headed, maybe not thinking as clearly, et cetera, et cetera. So diabetes is one of the most kind of prevalent and serious diseases of our modern world, because we eat way too much sugar. Our diets include so much more sugar than our ancestors ever evolved to deal with. So essentially our body's physiology just can't deal with this, and it manifests in a whole bunch of really nasty symptoms. And what I want to bring it back to the anatomy though, that's due to the imbalance in the production of these two hormones, glucagon and insulin, in the pancreas. In addition to that, the pancreas also includes these delta cells that secrete a hormone called somatostatin that basically helps kind of self-regulate the pancreas. And then another type of cell called PP cells, which secrete something called pancreatic polypeptide. And we think, so at least in terms of the most recent work that I've seen, we're not quite sure, but this plays a role in this exocrine secretion of these digestive enzymes. It's kind of fun. It's hard to say PP cells without giggling a little bit. So glucose regulation. Pancreas glucose regulation, and specifically, I do want you to know that we have these alpha cells that produce glucagon and the beta cells that produce insulin. Those are the two big ones. And glucagon and insulin kind of act to balance each other and keep your glucose within a certain level. And if you know anyone that has diabetes, they have either to test their blood glucose regularly, or they have a monitor that can actually have monitors now that can read your blood glucose in real time. And if that glucose gets too low, they might need to eat some gummy bears or drink a glass of orange juice or something and ramp it up. Or if it gets too high, they might need to take insulin or under serious conditions, even get an insulin shot to bring it back down. It's actually probably one of the most important scientific discoveries of the 20th century was when we figured out how to make insulin and not rely on kind of harvesting it from, I think they got it from pigs earlier. So it's very, very limited. So folks with diabetes would, suffer immensely. And then they figured out how to make it like easily and cheaply. But then all the pharmaceutical companies decided to sell it for like zillions of dollars. That's a whole other thing about medical ethics, but it's really, really, in the US anyway, it's super, super expensive to get insulin. And it's a big problem because that reduces its availability to people that really need it. Cool. Yes.
I looked up the surgery, they don't remove the adrenal gland unless there's something wrong.
They don't, so they keep it there and then they put the new kidney on top of it. Or well, often they don't need to replace, well, if it depends, if you're a kidney donor, then I would assume then you're okay with one kidney. So you get to keep your adrenal on that side. But then if you're a kidney recipient, you keep your adrenal and they pop the kidney. Oh, that's cool. Thanks, Holly. Huh. There you go. Yeah, now we know. Awesome. Okay, one last, actually, well, almost the last thing. The last thing I want to talk about is your gonads, specifically the testes and the ovaries. And these are the main sites, the sites of production and release of sex hormones. So for folks that are gonadally male, you have these special cells called interstitial cells in the testes that secrete a group of hormones called androgens. The primary one for our purposes is testosterone. You've all heard of that. And if you're gonadally female, then your follicle cells in your ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. And I meant to underline progesterone, I didn't underline that. Through these feedback mechanisms, this is actually why if someone's taking steroids, like for performance enhancing steroids, if you're male, your testes will actually shrink up, which seems kind of ironic. But what happens is you have this feedback loop where if there's the amount of testosterone that your testes produce is regulated by how much testosterone is in circulation. And so if there's only a little bit of testosterone in circulation, then through some signaling mechanisms, it tells your testes, hey, ramp it up, boys, let's produce some testosterone. What happens if you take exogenous testosterone for steroids for performance enhancing, if you're, I don't know, Jose Canseco or something like that, or any of the other baseball players from the 80s and 90s that were on steroids. What happens is your body has a ton of extra steroid in it already. And so that tells your testes like, all right, guys, we don't need you anymore. And what can actually happen is you have an excess of testosterone throughout your body, which signals your testes to not produce any more testosterone. So in turn, they actually get smaller. Testosterone is important, obviously, for sex drive. It controls a number of secondary sexual characteristics, like your voice lowering generally for males during puberty, body hair production, and things like that, but also controls behavior and things like that. And so we can see dramatic results of that again, just thinking about exogenous steroids or abuse of steroids, for things like quote unquote roid rage and things like that. So it shows your behavior in those pathways as well. So that's really all I want to say about this. We're not covering too much of the reproduction system here, but not surprisingly, the gonads are endocrine organs that help regulate reproduction and also behaviors around reproduction. So sex drive and things like that. You mentioned earlier too, just to bring this back, melatonin, which is produced in the what gland? Pineal gland, right? And that regulates sex drive as well, as I mentioned. Increase in melatonin basically makes you sleepy and ready for rest, and that decreases the sex drive and has an opposite effect of, for example, testosterone. Cool. We have just enough time. Actually, do I want to do this? I'm going to skip this. So I have this name that endocrine game, but I think what I'll do is play this with you. We can do it at the beginning of class on Monday. Will be a little review. The gist of it is going to be, I put pictures up and you tell me what gland it is and then what its primary role is. So be ready for that Monday morning. It's worth 1,000,000 class points. Otherwise, I'm gonna go back to my last slide here and we'll finish up the endocrine system and get to the respiratory system on Monday. Remember, have you gotten the email about course evaluations yet? I think you will this weekend or Monday. Make sure you do them for this class and all of your classes, please. Again, it's really valuable for us instructors. Final announcements. Dun, dun, dun. In your class program for Monday, I have a reminder to look at your grades in Blackboard and make sure it matches up with your assignments. Make sure there's nothing in there that you think you did that you don't have credit for, or maybe there's something you meant to make up, but you didn't, and communicate with me about that. Now's the time to get that sorted out. I don't want to, it's not good for any of us to like wait till the last minute when grades are due to try to get that sorted. All of your grades in Blackboard are as up to date as they can be. That includes your total course points as well as your current grade. And those grades in Blackboard will translate to your grade on your final grade for the course. So you know exactly where you stand in this class. If you have any questions, let me know. But again, now's the time to do that this week and next week. The times for the lab practical are in the class program. Again, remember I split the class in two. Half of you are going to start at 8:30, half at 10 o'clock. On Tuesday, the 13th. We have a quiz on Monday in class, closed book, 20 minutes, covering the lymphatic, immune, and endocrine systems. Note that we're not going to cover material from today's class. So I will cover, I should say I will cover like anterior, posterior, pituitary, because that was from Wednesday's class. But the new material today, starting with the thyroid gland, I'm not going to cover. I generally don't like to cover material from one class before on a quiz. I don't feel like it gives you enough time to prepare. So it will cover immune, lymphatic, and endocrine systems through what we covered on Wednesday. Danny's got tutorial sessions coming up as we wind up the course. Those are probably going to be pretty useful for you. I do have this did I share this one with the class? This is a good one. This is classic. Have I done that one yet this semester? I didn't think I did. Okay, that's good. And then just to tick it out to upload your Venn diagram and answer a couple questions about the endocrine system. Otherwise, guys, have a great weekend. Hang in there. I know it's crunch time in the semester for everybody. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, just shoot me an email and I will have open hours on Monday as well. Happy to chat. Yep. Actually, let me leave this recording. So the question is, how long is the lab practical? It's going to be the same amount of time as the other practical, which took people anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes generally. Having said that, there's not going to be a time limit. So I want to set it up so that you can take as much time as you need. So we'll rotate through the stations. We'll take somewhere between 30 and 40 minutes ish. I don't know exactly. And then you'll have as much time as you want to go back. I would probably, it won't take you more than an hour, but if it does, that's just fine.